My daughter looked me in the eyes across that polished boardroom table and told the lawyer she had never seen me struggle, not once. Not ever. I was 63 years old, sitting in a room full of people in expensive suits, and the child I had raised alone through 3 Edmonton winters without a working furnace, looked at a stranger and said, "My mother always managed just fine." I didn't cry. I had stopped crying in front of Audrey a long time ago. What happened next? When the lawyer opened the second folder, the one nobody in that room knew existed, would change every single life seated at that table, including hers. If this story speaks to something in your own life, I hope you'll stay with me until the end, because the truth, when it finally comes, rarely arrives quietly. My name is Frances Holloway. I turned 64 last March, and I live in a small house in Lethbridge, Alberta, the same house I bought with my late husband, Gerald's life insurance money back in 2001. It isn't much. 3 bedrooms, a yard that floods every spring, a kitchen where the third burner on the stove has never worked properly. But it is mine, and for 23 years it has been enough. Gerald died of a heart attack at 51. We had been married 26 years. Audrey was 19. The morning the hospital called, I was already at work. I was doing bookkeeping for a carpet supply company on the south side of the city. The kind of job nobody notices you doing until you stop doing it. When my manager drove me to the hospital, I remember thinking about the grocery list I had left on the counter. I remember thinking that I still needed to call about the car insurance. I remember everything except how to breathe. By the time I got there, Gerald was already gone. What followed was the kind of quiet chaos that death brings. Funeral arrangements, forms, phone calls, the slow and humiliating business of figuring out what was left and what wasn't. Gerald had been careful with money, cautious in the way that children of modest families tend to be. There was enough to keep the house, enough to help Audrey finish her second year of university, not much beyond that. I took a second job 3 months after he died, Saturday mornings at a garden center near the highway. It wasn't glamorous work, but the hours were steady, and the manager didn't mind that I sometimes cried, in the back room near the fertilizer bags, when I thought nobody could hear. Audrey didn't know about the second job for almost a year. I made sure of that. She was grieving too, and I didn't want her to feel the weight of our financial situation on top of everything else. I told her things were fine. Mothers do that. We say things are fine long after they've stopped being fine, because we'd rather carry the weight alone than watch our children buckle under it. She graduated. 4 years later, business degree, University of Alberta. I took the bus to Edmonton for the ceremony and sat in the nosebleed section of the auditorium because I'd arrived late after my shift. When they called her name, I stood up and clapped until the man beside me gave me a look. I didn't care. That was my daughter. That was 23 years of everything I had. The years after graduation were good ones, mostly. Audrey moved to Calgary for work. We talked every Sunday evening. She dated a few people who came and went. Then, about 4 years ago, she called to tell me about someone named Philip Crane. The way she talked about him made me smile at first. He was older than her by about 12 years, which gave me some pause, but Audrey had always been mature. He worked in commercial property development. He had grown children from a previous marriage. He had a house in Aspen Woods and a condo in Kelowna. She seemed genuinely happy. And so I listened, and I was glad for her. I met Philip Crane for the first time at a dinner in Calgary, a restaurant Audrey had chosen. Somewhere with a wine list that didn't have prices beside anything. He was tall, silver-haired, well-dressed in the particular way that men are when they've spent decades being well-dressed. He shook my hand firmly and smiled with his teeth and said, "Audrey talks about you all the time." He used my first name immediately, not Mrs. Holloway, just Frances. It's a small thing. I've thought about it many times since. It's a small thing that tells you quite a lot. His mother, Audrey told me later, had died when he was young. He had been raised by his father, a developer, and had grown the business considerably since then. Crane Property Group was his. Had been for over 20 years. The kind of company whose sign you see on the side of buildings going up all over Calgary's West End. I tried to like him. I genuinely did. He was charming enough. He asked me questions about Lethbridge, about my work, about Gerald. But there was something underneath the charm that felt calculated. like a man who has learned which questions make a good impression, without being particularly interested in the answers. Audrey and Philip got engaged 14 months after they met. She called me on a Tuesday evening, and I could hear the happiness in her voice before she said a single word. I told her I was thrilled, and I was, mostly. The engagement changed things between us in ways I didn't fully understand at first. The Sunday calls became shorter. When I did speak with Audrey, the conversation had a new direction. Philip was having the kitchen redesigned. They were looking at a property in Portugal. Philip had introduced her to some people who might be interested in backing her consulting idea. Everything circled back to Philip. Everything good in her life, it seemed, could be traced to him. At Christmas that year, I was invited to stay at their house for 4 days. Their house was beautiful. Enormous windows, heated floors, a staircase that swept upward in a wide curve. I slept in the guest room, with the door that didn't quite close, and lay awake listening to the house settle. On my second evening, I heard them talking in the kitchen after they thought I had gone to bed. I wasn't trying to listen. I had come down for a glass of water. "She means well," Audrey was saying. A pause. Then Philip. "She does. I just never know what to talk to her about." Another pause. "She comes from a different world, sweetheart." The words weren't cruel. They were almost gentle. That's what made them so difficult to walk away from. A different world. As though I were a visitor from somewhere my daughter had long since left behind. As though the woman who had packed her school lunches and sat beside her hospital bed when she had her appendix out, and driven through a February blizzard to help her move into her first apartment, belonged to some other story entirely. Not this one. Not the polished, expensive, important one she was building now. I went back upstairs without my water. I lay in the dark for a long time. The wedding was planned for the following September. Philip's people handled almost everything. The venue was a vineyard outside Penticton. The guest list ran to 230 people. I was given a role in the ceremony that felt both thoughtful and ceremonial, the way you give someone a title without giving them any real authority. I offered to contribute to the cost. Audrey told me it wasn't necessary. Philip told me the same thing, more firmly. In the months before the wedding, I noticed small things. Audrey stopped asking my opinions about decisions. When I offered thoughts about the reception, she thanked me in the voice people use when they've already decided and aren't going to change their mind. When I mentioned Gerald once, something Gerald would have liked about the flowers she'd chosen, Philip redirected the conversation with practiced ease. I started to feel, very gradually, like a guest at my own daughter's life. The wedding itself was beautiful, I won't pretend otherwise. The vineyard was golden in September light. Audrey was radiant. I sat in the front row on the bride's side and watched my daughter marry a man I did not entirely trust, and I kept my face arranged into something that looked like joy. At the reception, Philip gave a speech. He talked about Audrey's intelligence, her ambition, her capacity for growth. He talked about the future they were building together. He thanked his business partners and his children from his first marriage and several colleagues' selves, by name. He thanked me last. Brevity, I have learned, is sometimes its own message. Things between Audrey and me grew quieter after the wedding. Not hostile, just quiet. The Sunday calls became bi-weekly, then monthly. When we did speak, there was a careful pleasantness to it, like two people being polite at a work function. Then, about 18 months after the wedding, I received a letter. It came from a law firm in Calgary. Not Philip's firm. A different one. The letter was addressed to me personally, and it was from a lawyer named Howard Bellamy. He had been my husband Gerald's solicitor for the last 3 years of his life. I hadn't heard that name in over 2 decades. The letter said, simply, that there were matters related to Gerald's estate that had never been formally concluded, and that he believed it was time we spoke. I read the letter 3 times at my kitchen table. Then I put it in the drawer beside the phone, and made myself a cup of tea, and sat looking out the window at the backyard, where the first snow of the season was coming down sideways. Gerald! What had Gerald not told me? We had been honest with each other. I had always believed that. He was not a secretive man. He was thoughtful, quiet, careful, but not secretive. And yet Howard Bellamy's letter sat in my drawer, with a weight I couldn't explain. I called the number on the letterhead the following morning. Howard Bellamy's assistant put me through within a few minutes. His voice was older than I expected, measured, careful in the way of a man who has learned to say difficult things without saying them carelessly. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "thank you for calling. I've been wondering whether to reach out for some time now. What is this about?" "It's about Gerald," he said, "and it's about Crane Property Group." I sat down very slowly. I had not mentioned Philip Crane to Howard Bellamy. I had not mentioned Audrey's marriage, and yet he had just connected my late husband's name to the company that now belonged, in one way or another, to my daughter's husband. "I think you should come to Calgary," he said. I booked a seat on the first morning bus. Howard Bellamy's office was on the 18th floor of a glass tower on 5th Avenue Southwest. He was in his late 70s, white-haired, with the kind of unhurried manner that comes from decades of telling people things they weren't expecting to hear. When I sat down across from him, he set a thick folder on the desk between us and left his hand resting on top of it. "How much did Gerald tell you about his early career?" he asked. I thought. He worked for a development company. Before we were married. He left when we moved to Lethbridge. Howard nodded slowly. "Did he tell you the name of that company?" Something shifted in the room. I didn't know why yet. "No, I don't think so." Howard opened the folder. The company's name was familiar to me immediately, not because I had heard it recently, but because I had seen it on the side of a building going up near the Deerfoot Trail. I had seen it on a sign in Audrey's neighborhood. I had seen it on the contract Philip Crane had once left open on his kitchen counter when I was visiting, and which I had not looked at closely enough. Crane Property Group, or rather, its predecessor. The original company that had become Crane Property Group. Gerald's name was on the founding documents. I looked up at Howard. My throat felt very strange. "Gerald was one of 3 original partners," Howard said quietly. "He contributed significantly to the initial capital and the early land acquisitions. Before the first major project was complete, there was a dispute. Gerald chose to step back. A pause. Or he was made to believe he should." "What does that mean?" Howard removed another document from the folder. In the final months before Gerald withdrew from the partnership, there were several agreements signed. Some of those agreements were straightforward. Some of them were not. He slid a page across the desk. Gerald signed a document transferring his partnership interest in exchange for what he was told was fair market compensation. Was it? Howard was quiet for a moment. No. The room felt smaller. I thought about Gerald, about how careful he was with money, how cautious, how he never talked about regrets, about how he had taken a bookkeeping job when we settled in Lethbridge and seemed content to let that earlier life go. "He knew," I said. "It wasn't quite a question." "He suspected," Howard said carefully. "He came to me about 3 years before he died. He had seen something in the news about a crane development project. A large one. He did some of his own research and he had concerns. He wasn't certain, but he was concerned." "Why didn't he tell me?" Howard looked at me with the patient sadness of a man who had sat across from many grieving people over many decades. "Because he was dying, Francis, and because he thought there would be time." I closed my eyes. There is something particular about learning that the person you loved most was protecting you right up until the moment he could no longer protect anyone. It doesn't make you angry at them. It breaks your heart in an entirely new direction. "He left instructions," Howard said. "A sealed letter, documents to be kept secure. He told me that if circumstances ever changed, if you ever had reason to look more closely at what had happened, I should help you do that." "What circumstances?" Howard looked at me directly. He said, "If Crane ever becomes part of your family's life." The silence in that office was unlike any silence I have experienced before or since. My son-in-law's company. The company my daughter had married into. The company Gerald had helped build from the beginning, been pushed out of, and never spoken about again. I stayed in Calgary for 2 days. Howard and I went through everything. The original partnership agreement, the correspondence from the final months before Gerald withdrew, the compensation records. There was a second man. A former executive named Stuart Kowalski, who had also been present at the beginning, and who Howard had already been in contact with. Stuart, it turned out, had been waiting for years for someone to ask the right questions. What they showed me was this. Gerald's interest in the company, at the time of his withdrawal, had been substantially undervalued. The compensation he received had been based on projections that were deliberately conservative. Within 18 months of his departure, the company's first major project had tripled in assessed value. The terms of his withdrawal agreement had a clause, buried on page 11, that Gerald had signed without fully understanding its implications. Howard believed that clause had not been explained to him honestly. The man who had negotiated that clause, on behalf of the other partners, was Philip Crane's father. I sat with that for a long time. Then I asked Howard the question I had been building toward since I first read his letter. What exactly did Gerald preserve? Howard opened the sealed envelope that had sat in his files for 23 years. The paper inside was Gerald's handwriting. I knew it like I know my own face. Near the bottom of the page, he had underlined a single sentence. If any of this ever surfaces, protect Frances. She earned every bit of it. I had to look away. Howard let me sit quietly for a moment. Then he said, Gerald retained a private interest. A small one, structured carefully before he signed the withdrawal agreement. It was never disclosed to the other partners. It was technically within the rights granted by an earlier clause in the original partnership agreement. He paused. It was Gerald's insurance policy, in case things were ever worse than he realized. How significant. Howard was quiet. Then, significant enough that Philip Crane would very much prefer you not know about it. I understood then why Philip had looked at me the way he did across restaurant tables. Why he had been so careful to make me feel small and peripheral and belonging to a different world. It wasn't contempt for a woman from Lethbridge with a second-hand coat and a third burner that didn't work. It was something much older than that. 3 weeks later, Philip hosted what he described as a celebration dinner. He had recently announced a significant expansion of Crane Property Group's commercial division and was gathering investors, partners, board members, and what he called the people who matter to mark the occasion. Audrey sent me a formal invitation. It felt, reading it, like the kind of invitation extended out of obligation. I attended. Howard Bellamy attended with me. The dinner was held in a private room at a hotel in downtown Calgary. Chandelier, white linen, servers who moved without making sound. Philip moved through the room like a man collecting affirmations. Audrey stood beside him in a green dress, looking beautiful and slightly fixed in place. When she saw me arrive, something moved across her face. Surprise, I think, and something else I couldn't name. Mom. She came forward and hugged me. The hug lasted exactly the right amount of time, no longer. Philip noticed Howard a moment later. I watched him process the information. He was skilled at composure, but there was a fraction of a second. Something in the set of his jaw that told me he recognized the name on Howard's business card. Mr. Bellamy, he said. Neutral, careful, Mr. Crane. Howard was equally neutral. Thank you for the invitation. Dinner proceeded. Speeches were made. Philip announced the expansion with the polished ease of a man accustomed to making announcements. He talked about legacy. He talked about vision. He talked about the company his father had built, and that he had grown. Gerald Holloway. He did not mention, when Howard stood up, there was a brief moment where the room wasn't sure what was happening. Howard was not on the program. Before we continue, he said, in the quiet, steady voice of a man who has been preparing for this for 23 years. There are some historical matters related to Crane Property Group that require acknowledgement. The room did not go silent immediately. It went silent in stages, table by table, conversation by conversation, until the only sound was the faint clink of a fork being set down somewhere. Philip said, "This is not the time or place." Howard opened his briefcase. "I'm afraid it is, Mr. Crane." What followed was methodical and calm and devastating. Howard did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize. He simply presented documents, explained their relevance, and allowed the room to understand what they were hearing. The founding of the original company. The 3 partners. Gerald Holloway's contribution and subsequent withdrawal. The terms of that withdrawal, and the questions Howard had spent years researching. The private interest Gerald had preserved. The clause in the original partnership agreement that gave it legal standing. And then finally, the transfer of that interest. To me, I heard Audrey make a sound I have never heard from her before. Not anger, not grief, something between them. Philip stood. Those documents were superseded. They were not. Howard set 3 pages side by side on the table. I anticipated that argument. Here is why. The investors in the room had begun to exchange looks. Board members were leaning together, speaking quietly. A woman near the back had already picked up her phone. Philip looked at me for a long moment. For the first time since I had known him, he did not look like a man who was managing a situation. He looked like a man who had miscalculated. I held his gaze and said nothing. Audrey came to me after. Not immediately. Not while the room was still absorbing everything. She waited until people had begun to leave, until Philip had retreated to a corner with 2 of his lawyers, until the chandelier light had started to feel less like elegance and more like exposure. She sat down beside me. For a long time, neither of us spoke. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I know you didn't. He never told me anything about your father and the company. Never, I believe you." She looked at her hands. "How long have you known?" "Not long. A few weeks." Silence, then. "Why didn't you call me?" It was the right question. The honest answer was that I wasn't sure she would have believed me. That I wasn't sure she would have chosen me. That I had been living inside the quiet demotion of the past few years, and I hadn't trusted what I would find if I looked directly at it. "I needed to be certain first," I said. She was quiet for a while. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for, not with greed in her voice, but with something that sounded more like guilt. "What are you going to do with it?" I looked at my daughter. She had Gerald's eyes. I hadn't thought about that in years. "I'm going to do what your father would have done," I said. Something useful. The weeks that followed were not simple. Legal matters rarely are. Philip contested certain elements through his solicitors. Howard had anticipated most of the arguments, and the ones he hadn't, Stuart Kowalski helped address. Stuart had his own documentation. He had been quiet for a long time. He was done being quiet. Philip's board demanded an independent review. Several of his investment partners asked uncomfortable questions. The announcement he had made at that dinner, the expansion, the vision, the legacy, sat awkwardly in the Calgary business press while the questions hung in the air. He did not collapse overnight. People like Philip rarely do. But the story shifted. And once a story shifts, it tends to keep shifting. Audrey called me more often now. The calls were different than they had been in years. Longer, less careful. She asked about Gerald, about what he'd been like before she was old enough to really know him. I told her stories I had kept mostly to myself. Small stories, the kind that don't seem important until they suddenly are. How he used to leave notes on the kitchen table, instead of saying things out loud, because he found writing easier than talking. How he made the same joke every time it snowed. How he cried at the part in films where someone came home. She listened the way she used to listen when she was young. One afternoon she asked me whether I was angry at Philip. I thought about it honestly. I said. For a while, I was angry at the condescension, mostly. At being made to feel like I came from a different world. "You didn't deserve that. Nobody does." A pause. Then, "I should have said something when I noticed how he talked to you sometimes." I didn't tell her it would have changed things. I didn't know if it would have. But I told her that it mattered to hear her say it now. And that was true. Gerald's private interest, once legally recognized, represented a meaningful stake in what Crane Property Group had become over 23 years of growth. I won't give you a number, because numbers are not the point of this story. What I will tell you is that it was enough to do what I set out to do. The Francis and Gerald Holloway Legacy Fund was registered with the Alberta government in the spring. Its purpose is to support widowed and separated women over 50 who are navigating financial instability and family isolation, emergency assistance, legal support, housing resources, and what I think matters most, someone who will sit across a table from you and treat you like your experience is worth listening to. Howard came to the small opening event we held at a community hall in Lethbridge. Stuart Kowalski came as well, which surprised me and moved me more than I expected. Audrey came. She brought flowers and stayed to help set up the chairs. At one point, she and I were standing side by side at the window watching people arrive. It's the end of April afternoon. Southern Alberta sometimes offers, cold in the shade and warm in the sun, and the parking lot was filling up with women who had driven from as far as Medicine Hat and Red Deer, because someone had sent them the information, and they had thought, perhaps, this was worth the drive. He would have liked this, Audrey said. She meant Gerald. Yes, I said. He would have. She reached over and took my hand, just for a moment. The way she used to when she was small. We didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else that needed to be said right then. I think about Gerald often. I think about the note he left in Howard's office, the careful, quiet way he tried to protect me from something he wasn't sure would ever materialize. I think about the years I spent being careful with money, adding up groceries, wearing things until they wore out, telling Audrey things were fine. I think about how the truth, when it finally arrives, often carries with it the shape of something you always suspected but couldn't quite see. I am 64 years old. I live in a house with a yard that floods every spring and a third burner that still doesn't work. I am building something that matters. I have my daughter back. Not the same way. I had her before. Something different. Something that was built out of honesty instead of performance. And I am learning, later than I would have liked, what Gerald always seemed to know. That the most valuable things are rarely the ones that announce themselves. They wait quietly, they hold their ground, and they are still standing long after everything louder has gone.